As part of our discussions on 19th century short fiction, I would like to introduce today a writer from the 19th century, a woman writer. Her name was Charlette Perkins Gilman. Charlette Perkins Gilman is famous for one of her short stories that I'd be discussing today, The Yellow Wallpaper. But before I discuss her story, I'd like you to also understand a bit about the writer herself. She was born in 1860 and was there till about 1935. She was born in Connecticut in New England and was actually Charlotte Anna Perkins. She was a woman with very clear convictions about her role and about the purpose of life. As early as when she was 21 years old, she would write diaries, and those diaries together, of course, have become her autobiography today. Her autobiography was published posthumously. But there are two things that I'd like you to notice at the outset. One, that she is a part of the New England atmosphere. And I've discussed in my previous lectures also how the New England was the hub of all intellectual activity and how it was a seat of culture. It has housed many writers, whether we speak of Emily Dickinson or we speak of Hawthorne, Melville. All these writers, grew up around this area where, there was freedom of thought and expression. Also remember that when she is born by 1860, she already has behind her the tradition of women writing about women's rights. For instance, Margaret Fuller, who was an American feminist, wrote this very famous book, Woman in the 19th Century, and that was published in the 1950s. So you find that by the time she's around the scene, there is already a lot of groundwork that has taken place, and women have begun to assert themselves and they've begun to write about their lives and rights. So she grew up in such an environment. Again, she saw privation very early in life when her father left her and the mother had to fend for the two children. Very early in life, she also started to earn whatever bits she could, first as designing some trade cards, and then also teaching some kind of art to young pupil. So she became, in a way, relatively independent, economically speaking, very early in life. And interestingly, I find it very interesting that in the 19th century, a woman could have such clarity about her own position and her role in society. Very few women take that kind of stance where they have a clear sense of conviction. And to notice that, I'd like you to see some of the excerpts from her autobiography and see how she talks about herself as early as when she's 21 years old. And I quote, she writes, 21, my own mistress at last. No one on earth had a right to ask obedience of me. I was self-supporting, of course, a necessary base for freedom, which the young revolters of today often overlook. This freedom never meant self-indulgence. From 16, I had not wavered from that desire to help humanity, which underline all my studies. So the idea that that freedom of freedom in terms of self-sufficiency, in order to be able to earn some support yourself, is the most important base for any kind of movement to exist. She says that the young revolters of today forget the fact that they need to be independent and they need to be self-supporting, as she has been. And the fact that, she says, I'm a mistress of my own self and nobody on this earth could ask obedience of me now that I'm 21. So there is, you see, while there are social structures which weigh heavy on all of us and include especially women in the 19th century, you find that she has the courage to be able to clear herself of all these shackles that otherwise bind women, these kind of doubts and apprehensions that they might have. She is very sure of her stance that, I'm not bound to be obedient to anybody now. So what made her this kind of a person, that nobody could ask obedience of me? I mean, of course, if you look at it, this exercise, if you look at this point of view, you realize you really are not supposed to be obedient to anyone, and yet how many ties and invisible ties bind us to being obedient to patriarchy as such. The fact that this woman early in her life in the 19th century has been able to come to the conclusion and call it out, and they have the courage to speak of her free will and her freedom is, I think, commendable in itself, because very few women in the 19th century could do that. Most of these women spoke about women's rights, equality, but they did so from within the very patriarchal structure of marriage and other institutions. They did not think of rebelling against them completely. But here you have a writer who's ready to call out this kind of a system, and in very, very clear terms. She's sharp and angry in her fiction, and also in her non-fiction. There's a very wry sense of humor that she has, and this is for you, Charlette Perkins Gilman. As I go along forward, I would also like to discuss her growth as a writer as well. So by the 1880s, she felt within her a tremendous, what she calls in her autobiography, a tremendous sense of power, even glorious power, of ability to do whatever I decided to undertake. This is the kind of a person that she's forming into. By the 1880s, she feels that, she's turning into the person that she feels she can decide to be a person and stay there. That is again something which comes with a lot of self-realization, that she feels that she has the ability, that nothing can stop her, that she has a kind of a tremendous sense of power within, that nothing can stop her from achieving her goals, and whatever she decides to undertake, she can achieve it. So that for a writer in in the 19th century, when so much of crackdown is available, when there's extreme sense of repression leading to hysteria in women and all other forms that it has taken in the 19th century, to have a writer, it is a breath of fresh air, I would say. Look at how she decides, she got married twice, but when she was trying to come to the conclusion of her marriage at the age of 24, she had these conflicting emotions. And again, in her autobiography, The Living of Charlette Perkins Gilman, she refers to this clash between the accepted code of conduct and her own will and strivings. Now, why I've taken this particular quote that I read to you is because I also want you to look at the kind of pressures that were active on women in the 19th century. It is also the case today that women still have to deal with the pressures of marriage coming on to them, not just through the elders in the family, but also through the kind of convention that and peer pressure that people around you are a part of it, and then you don't want to be an outsider, right? And so she deals with this conflicting emotion and this question in the following way, and I quote, "My mind was not fully clear as to whether I should or should not marry. On the one hand, I knew it was normal and right in general, and held that a woman should be able to have marriage and motherhood and do her work in the world also. On the other, I felt strongly that for me it was not right, that the nature of the life before me forbade it, that I ought to forego the more intimate personal happiness for complete devotion to my work." So in a way, what I'm trying to tell you here through this quotation is that there are pressures that are active on any woman, and especially Gilman at this particular point, when she's faced with marrying this man, then she's thinking of the roles that are already present before her, what others around her have been doing, and then she comes to the point that, but it's not for me. I'm meant for bigger things, and that I'm meant to forego the personal, intimate happiness for the complete devotion to my work. So here is a woman who has a strong conviction and a passionate desire to do well, to work for humanity, and especially for women's rights. So in this, such a woman, when she formulates, her works, and, she's written essays also. Very interestingly, there is a very famous book of her, Women and Economics, where she talks about again the same issue of how being self-sufficient, economically independent is the very basis for life and dignity of life, and that it cannot be seen as a choice. Rather, it is something that women must take up at all costs. So at another place, where writing is a way through which Gilman found a sort of release and self-expression. She says, and I quote, I try to describe this long limitation, hoping that with such power as is now mine, and such use of language as is within that power, this will convince anyone who cares about it that the living of mine had been done under a heavy handicap, unquote. That she's using language, she's using this kind of the pen to speak her mind, to express herself, and yet that she has been restricted by social norms, and that there is a heavy handicap that restricts the woman writer. You see, as much as we focus on the text, for instance the yellow wallpaper, we also need to understand the predicament and the anxiety of the 19th century woman writer, who was and because there were not only restrictions of morality, but also restrictions of class, restrictions of domesticity that were imposed on women. So they were relegated to the domestic sphere, kept away from intellectual work. The intellectual work was not available. Let's not forget that there were no universities where women could go. They were either self-schooled or they went to small little institutions here and there, but no university, no big university that you know of today actually allowed women to study. So there was a kind of an intellectual handicap as well, and marriage became the only choice for such women in the 19th century, and which in a way led to a kind of an extreme sort of mental repression and trauma. So these are some of the conditions that the woman writer in the 19th century had to face, and Gilman, in the quote that I just read out to you, specifies that it is not easy to use language which is already patriarchal. The structures of language are patriarchal. So how do you use a language that is necessarily set against your own interests? And that the very fact that you're trying to express, you will find that the handicap of being a woman within quotes comes to the fore. So, the story, the yellow wallpaper, which is what I want to also discuss at length, was actually published in 1892. And she's also written a book of verse. So in many ways, she's an editor, a poet, a short story writer, a precursor to the feminist voice that you see rising during this period, along with the likes of Margaret Fuller and Kate Chopin. So you see her in this framework of the 19th century in America, and you realize that she's constantly writing. For instance, in her book in Our World, she wrote in 1893. There's a very interesting book that she wrote, which is also titled Her Land. It's a kind of a feminist utopia where she speaks of a world which is only inhabited by women, where there are no men, right? And in this world, women take care of everything. They also have children in a very asexual manner, and they are managing states of polity and governance and all of that. And this is something that is very it's obviously very amusing to read such a work, but she's trying to visualize a kind of a world where women would be free to express themselves and to be able to live their lives as men are free to live. So I think in her fictional and non-fictional work, she tries to build a world where women have more freedom, and also underlines this kind of mental trauma that women go through in the lack of it. So she spent years between 1895 and 1900 also in delivering lectures in various places, and it is during this point in time that she also became more evolved as a person, and could concretely write her ideas down, which were then brought together in Women and Economics that I mentioned to you, published in 1898. So it is a kind of a formidable work that these women are doing in the 19th century, continuously lecturing, writing books, fiction, non-fiction, and to bring to the fore women-centric issues that are often left in the background. Importantly, she edited this periodical which was called The Forerunner, and she was 50 years old then. A very interesting anecdote about her life, she shares in her autobiography, when she says that when she was 21, and I'd like you to look at this anecdote as well, and I quote, she says, "One day in the gymnasium, during a rest period, the girls were discussing what age they would rather be for life. Most of them agreed on 18, which many of them were at the time. When they asked me, I said 50. They didn't believe it. Why? They demanded. Because I explained when I'm 50, people will respect my opinions if they are ever going to, and I shall not be too old to work, unquote. So you see a kind of a humor there, of course, that women, she was also one of the votaries of the dress reform bill, and the idea that women's clothes should be in a manner that they attract men was something that she constantly tried to dispel, this kind of a myth that that women want to stay in, or girls, if they had to live in a particular age, they would be at 18, because at that time they'd be most beautiful and they would like to remain and freeze in time in that beauty. But what is more important for Gilman here is not beauty, is not youth, rather it is the life of ideas. And therefore she says at 50 I'll be in a place where nobody can drive me out, and people will respect my opinions if they are going to, right? So that she wants to be known for her opinions, and that she is not too old to work, so she can still continue. So the work that she wants to do, it would still be at the center of things. But an intellectual life and a world of opinions and ideas is where she sees herself, and she believes that women who are who are set with the logic that let's stay 18, they are stuck with the logic that they must be desirable for men, and that their clothes and their body and their face must always remain desirable for men. So in a way, she is dispelling this kind of a myth when she talks about it, about the kind of work that she wants to do. Why I've taken this quote is because she says at 50 I became the editor of the Forerunner, the magazine that I just told you about, the periodical magazine. So she took up this task of becoming an editor of the Forerunner at the age of 50, and she says that I was reminded of this time when I said this to these women. So you can still see this kind of clarity of thought, and also a clarity of action in terms of what she wants to do. Now, I would also like you to have us, I will of course take up at length in my following lecture the yellow wallpaper, but I want you to see how the yellow wallpaper was received. At the turn of the century, when she wrote this story, there was a physician who claimed that the story could have a deadly impact on the minds of the reader and could rob one of one's mental stability. Now, what did he mean by that? He deemed this story to be dangerous, not only on grounds of morality, but also on account of keeping intact the mental equanimity of people. So he's actually referring to a sense of mental stability that is it is precarious, because this story can drive you towards a kind of madness. So that is the imagine that is the kind of response that this story evoked, and she's best known for this story among, of course, her other works. But because this story is an angry take, at the same time it brings in a lot of questions at the time of women's hysteria on the question of motherhood as institution that comes down heavily on women. At the same time, the experience of motherhood, which may differ for all women, the experience of being in marriage with a man who's condescending and patronizing. So I think these are some of the things that she picks up for evaluation and picks up for rethinking in this story. And she takes recourse to a kind of a spooky world that she tries to build, but it is a story that asserts women's desire and women's will to break free from all these barriers. So I'll take up this discussion in my following lecture, and also take up how the yellow paper in a way yellow wallpaper in a way redefines the way women writing at the time took place, how women were constantly now not just bent on writing like men, as it used to be the case in a lot of 19th century literature, but writing like themselves, or writing as women. You see, much of 19th century literature was based on this idea that women are not good enough and as men, and so women were constantly under pressure to write like men. But the moment they wrote like men, they realized that they were actually turning the whole idea against themselves, because writing like men meant following the patriarchal structure. But you will find here that in the yellow wallpaper, you find Gilman is able to also break the patriarchal norms, or I would say the conventional norms of writing that men generally undertake. So it is clearly not a male gaze that you see, it is very clearly the labyrinthine sort of elaborate workings of a woman's mind who is obviously under pressure and is going through a phase in her life. So these are some of the thoughts that I leave you with as we go along discussing Gilman's work. And I would like you to rethink Gilman from this perspective as a woman who is driven to work for society and humanity, but at the same time is conscious of her role as a practicing woman writer at the time, and her responsibility as a writer who must show the path to other women. So I think with that note, I would like to close this lecture today and see you for an elaborate discussion on the yellow wallpaper in my next lecture.